One, languages are needed to be responsive to all the 911 calls. What happens in Lawrence, Kansas when a call comes into the center downtown? They call KU and they say, do you have anybody who speaks Coptic Egyptian or speaks Tikrit dialect of Arabic? Yeah. So that is a very expensive proposition. As you know, when someone has to appear in court, the court in the United States, the court is obligated to provide a proficient interpreter. Yeah. That adds millions of dollars. In Los Angeles County, last year they had to deal with 116 different languages. In other words, you can take a driver's test in Arabic, in Chinese, in Japanese, in Tajik or Uzbek. That's very expensive because you have to hire people who speak these languages. So the budgets of every court are radically increased in the last few years because increasingly you have people who don't speak English or don't speak German. So with all reference to you, I would say that learning the language of the culture in which you live is absolutely necessary for you to integrate yourself into the life of the community. If you can't do that, obviously there are exceptions. In Germany, if you are 80 and you don't learn German in 5 years, they're not going to deport you. But I'm talking about working population. You must learn the language. So this stream of people that is arriving, they all have different languages. In many areas of Greece, they can't take any kind of personal reference. Therefore, in Germany, one of the real problems where they need anthropologists is that they can't tell the age of the people that come in. And if you apply for refugee status in Germany, it is much easier if you are under 18, because then you come as a child unaccompanied by parents or by your family. Therefore, you are treated very differently. So guess what happens? People who are 25 come in and say, I'm 17.
Really?
So how can you check the age? Well, you can check the age by teeth, by your skull, by many of the physical features, but you need people who do that. I don't have to tell you that at the moment there are about 17 million people waiting to cross the Mediterranean. Are we really equipped to deal with 17 million people coming? So when you deal, and obviously I'm an immigrant, my wife is an immigrant, I have gone through the process. I was very fortunate. I became an American because I wore an American soldier's uniform. So it wasn't very difficult to become an American. But I'm telling you, if we are dealing with newcomers, we must think about education. We must think about how are we integrating people that have a different culture, have a different way of looking at everyday life. This is not easy, and we have very little discussion about what our schools, our universities could do in helping to integrate people who come to our country. Obviously, Germany is solving some of the problems by sending individuals to different communities according how big these communities are. If you have a small community of 100 people maybe, well, they will send one refugee. If you have a city of 500,000, obviously, then you get maybe 1,000. So they are distributing the people in different areas as we are doing it in the United States. But we have very little backup in terms of teaching individuals that culture has consequences, that you have to have a process by which you help people to integrate them into an everyday community. If any of you have been to Berlin and you have been to Kreuzberg, you know that you are in Turkey. You are not in Germany.
That's right.
There are 3 million Turks in Germany. There are probably several 100,000 in Switzerland. Switzerland is a country with roughly 8 million people. 6 million Swiss and 2 million non-Swiss. We just recently, my wife is a Buddhist. We recently talked to a Tibetan monk in a small Swiss town, and we asked him, when you give your lectures and your teachings, what language are you using? This is in eastern Switzerland. He said, it's High German. Okay, he's learning German, but then he said, because recently, and that's part of evolution, recently the Swiss, making obviously a lot of money in China, Switzerland is the first European country that has bilateral treaties about commerce and industry with the People's Republic of China. They're exporting Nestle, and other big Swiss companies are exporting to China. So guess what? Tibetans that have come to Switzerland since the 1950s. Switzerland was the first country to take 800 Tibetan children in 1959. Today, the Swiss government, because business demands it, have made a deal with the Chinese that every Tibetan who used to travel on a Tibetan-Indian travel document has to register with the Chinese embassy, because Tibet is China. That means that when a Tibetan walks into the Chinese embassy in Bern, they have to sign 2 papers. One paper says, I will never travel to India. The second paper says, I will denounce the Dalai Lama as the leader of the Tibetan Buddhist community. That is happening as we are speaking. So, this Tibetan monk in this small eastern Swiss town said, I want to become a Swiss. So now I'm learning Schweizerdeutsch, which is as some of you know, is a is a language. The Germans don't understand the Swiss, but the Swiss understand the Germans because they learn High German in school. So I'm telling you, today anthropologists should not just take courses in world culture or the people of China or Africa, but they must learn what are we doing with these millions of people that are crossing borders, trying to integrate themselves into a new community.
Mm.
Oh, look at that, that's terrible.
Mm.
Culture. What is the definition of culture? How many of you, if I ask you, give me a workable definition of culture, how many of you could do that? I mean, be honest.
It's what we used to have.
Yeah, what is culture? Can I have a volunteer who tells me?
It's a certain way of living, and I don't know. You say I'm British, so I say the British culture. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, which is very close to American culture.
Yeah.
I mean, the language is different, but you can communicate very meaningfully. Culture is man's social heredity. In other words, human beings have a biological heredity. In other words, my genetic makeup could not make me into a KU basketball player because obviously
Too short.
I'm from southern Germany and I'm alpine. I was a very good skier. If I can assure you, if you are 6'7", you're not going to be a very good downhill skier. You're just too tall. So we are the product really of our genes. So I'm telling students, rather than if you want to get married to somebody, you may ask, can I see your tax return? So you know. But now I'm telling them, in order to really save lots of money during your hopefully long-term marriage, ask them for a genetic makeup. In other words, you will learn how many dollars you can save for dentists. You will learn that maybe you will get Alzheimer's and therefore you may not get married. So I think before you get married, it would be very useful, rather than following only American culture, you ask for a genetic map of your prospective mate, and you will save a lot of money. So anyway, culture is really what we learn from our parents, what we learn from the schools, what we learn in the universities, what we learn from our literature. In other words, it's the carrying on of a tradition. We have heard in the last few days a lot about Muslims. I have tried very much in my teaching to ask people, could you tell me in 3 minutes what Alawites really are all about? As you may know, Bashar al-Assad in Syria is an Alawite Muslim.
Oh, okay.
Alawites are a sect of Shia Islam. I have found very few people who ever heard about Alawites. Well, that brings me to a very practical aspect of culture that I have found here at KU. Obviously, in many ways, at times I have been very controversial because I did go to, in my case, to Laos rather than Vietnam. obviously I was in the Korean War, and I remember my name was on Hook Auditorium, and it was on Fraser Hall, because I always welcomed discussion about the Vietnam conflict because I had actually been there. Today, we are discussing things we don't have the faintest idea what we are talking about. In order to integrate the different Muslims into American society, for crying out loud, we should know a little bit more what are the differences between Shia and Sunni Muslims. Why do we have the two popes of Islam, one in Tehran and the other one in Saudi Arabia, who have made war on each other for several thousand years? If we don't understand the language and the culture of Iraq, not to say anything about Afghanistan, where you have Tajiks, you have Uzbeks, you have Hazara, you have Pashtuns. How can we send young Americans in these areas without knowing anything of the local culture? I remind audiences, military audiences, that why is it that the United States has probably the finest intelligence technology? We listen to lots of phone calls. We listen to hundreds of communications on the internet. I used to work in Hawaii in the same office as the famous person who is now in Russia worked. I didn't know him, but I am well aware that we had rooms filled with paper that nobody could read because we don't have the languages and the skills to read really our intercepts. So I ask audiences, how is it that with this advanced technology, which is probably one of the finest existing today, we have not done well in Korea? It's still an armistice, and North Korea is as dangerous as ever. We have not done well in Vietnam. We have not done well in Iraq. We have not done well in Afghanistan. And we have not done well in Syria. So I would respectfully ask any government official, how many languages do you speak? How much do you know really of the area in which you are committed to send young Americans? You know, have you ever raised this question? Have you ever raised the question that we cannot solve the culture conflict of Shia and Sunni Islam, but we should ask Muslims to help us to solve the problem? We can't call for a reformation of Islam in which Shia and Sunni interests converge, but we must rely on Muslims. So do we have in the United States Muslim brigades that go to Syria, that know about Alawites? We don't. So I think our discussion very often obviously is far off the mark when we talk about, do we admit Muslims? Should we admit Muslims? What are we going to do with them? Obviously, as an immigrant, I don't have to tell you that my answer would be, of course we must be an open society, but we must understand that people who do come have an obligation to make an effort to integrate into the existing culture. You don't necessarily want a Kreuzberg in Lawrence, Kansas. Somehow we must train people to help others that come to America to understand what our culture is like. We can't keep on sending young Americans abroad that have no idea of the power of culture, how to eat, what to eat, how to go to the bathroom. We are now talking about that all sexes must use the same bathroom. I have no real objection. If you want to do that, that's fine. Let's change our culture. But we must equip people to think in different ways than what we are doing. Today, I must sadly tell you, America today, in my 70 years, I have never seen America more divided than right now. Yesterday's headline in one of the German papers, that is probably one of the best papers, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, the headline was, people were asking what is left of President Obama.
Yeah.
And guess the headline of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung? It was, what is left of Obama are his speeches. Think about it. So, in order to give you time to subject me to some questions, I've worked in New Guinea. There were 600 different languages. You crossed one mountain and you were in an area of a different language and a different culture. So,
Do they have headhunters in New Guinea? Do they have headhunters in New Guinea?
headhunters?
Is New Guinea, then they have these, I don't know, something to do with New Guinea, I don't know what it was.
Well, there are areas where the first non-New Guinea individual met New Guineans was the 1920s.
Oh, really? Okay.
Before the 1920s, they had never, ever seen somebody from the outside.
Oh, okay.
Well, just let me go quickly
Chinese,
to
there's a
this.
Chinese.
Mm.
There's a Buddha.
And maybe that would be a good